Right, I think it's time for us to hop on over into Blender. So let's go ahead and do that. Hey.
Hello, you wonderful blenders.
So, hey, here I am floating in the void. I'll turn this on and off if someone shouts if I'm actually blocking something on the screen. And what I will do so it looks like I'm not disappearing.
Your cube is all black.
Hmm?
Your cube is all black.
I know, right?
What's wrong with it?
It's not the default cube. So we're going to start by just explaining what texture painting is. And you probably have guessed that it is painting with textures. So we've got a cube. So this cube here has already been unwrapped. And we'll go through all this process in a bit. But this is the default cube. It's already unwrapped. And this is its UV layout. And texture painting means that you can paint on any surface and it paints the texture. And we can do painting on either the texture side of things itself. So if you're very good at drawing, you can pop a smiley face in, and there we go. We've now got a smiley face on our cube. And you'll notice here that the orientation of some of the faces isn't always how you expect it to be. And we'll talk a little bit to begin with about UV unwrapping, because that really is, well, it's the first thing you need to do anyway. And it can be a bit hit and miss when you're doing it, especially when it comes to beginner work. So let's actually start off by creating a brand new Blender file. And we'll stay with a cube for the moment, because one of the things I don't want to do is start faffing around making models, but we'll do something like that towards the end. So we have our default cube here, and a default cube or any of the primitives that you can add all come with a UV unwrap, which is why when you go to a different workspace, so at the top here, in fact, I've noticed that this is slightly small. So let's go to Edit and Preferences and make this a bit larger. I usually go for a resolution scale of about 1.3. It causes me a few problems because I have to scroll, use my scroll wheel to go across these header bars at the top. But it's much better for you guys, especially if the resolution drops down on the stream. So if we go to the UV Editing Workspace, we've already got this UV map. And you might be thinking, oh, this looks different to what you just had a moment ago. And that's because I'm in edit mode at the moment. So if we were just in object mode, you wouldn't see it. When you're in edit mode, you will see it. And what we have here is what you probably call a traditional cube unwrap. And each of these squares that we have on the UV editor window represents one of the faces on here. Now, one of the things that you can do when it comes to UV Editing Workspace is you can stack these on top of themselves. And then, for instance, you can have all of the sides all look the same. In fact, that might be a good exercise in a bit. Say you were creating a crate, well, you might want all four of the sides to look the same and the top and the bottom to look the same. And so you can paint once and use it in multiple places. And I'm a big fan of reusing stuff wherever possible. Certainly if you're just creating your beginning assets, you don't want to keep making bespoke things when you can just reuse assets. And then later on, if you need something special, you can go ahead and do that. So we have a basic cube here, and we need to paint on it. So we'll go through the basic process first. Now, when it comes to unwrapping your model, assume we didn't have a UV unwrap. So we're starting from something that you've made yourself. And I can do that by turning off UV maps. Under your object data, you can actually have multiple UV maps, which can be also confusing if you've got the wrong one enabled. But if I delete that, there is now no UV map associated with our cube. Now, when it comes to unwrapping, you can do it face by face, or you can do the whole object at any one time. And for the purposes of getting going, we're not going to be focused on really, AAA stuff at this point in time. We're talking about, okay, we've got an object here. We want to be able to unwrap it, and we want to be able to paint on our object. I would always recommend unwrapping. So I'm going to press the U key with everything selected. That's important because we are unwrapping the entire object. As I say, you can select a face and just unwrap an individual face. If we select this face and press U, we get a big long list of things here. We're not going to focus on all of them, so we can click unwrap. You can see here, this face of our cube is now mapped, if there were a texture here, to this entire area. I don't want to do that. I want to unwrap the entire object. Now, if I select everything and just press U and unwrap, we get a failure. And that's because it can't unwrap something that's connected all together. So when it comes to the very, very beginnings of any texture painting, though it can sort of trip you up later on, maybe, I would always start by unwrapping and using a smart UV project. And then we get a series of options here. We can change these after the fact as well. So I'm just going to click OK for the moment. And you can see it's unwrapped the cube differently to how it was unwrapped before. We don't have this T or cross shape anymore. We've got a staircase. Absolutely fine. There's no right or wrong when it comes to unwrapping. But what we do need to be conscious of is if this is an image representing each individual face, the smaller these faces are on our image, the less detail there will be in it because it will be a smaller part of the image. And this is why it can be quite in depth and quite a challenge, almost like a puzzle, to actually do unwrapping in an amazing way. This area here, the opposite, the negative of what's not being used, basically, all of this area is wasted UV space at the moment because we're not using it for any detail. And Melicon, I can see, is texel density. Yes. I'm not going to go into the details of what texels are today. I don't think that's important to actually get things going. But it's a great discussion to actually have when it comes to averaging out your scene's detail. So we have an unwrap and we have an object. So we're basically saying that these faces, and look there, with the sync selection at the top turned off, so UV space at the top here, we can select our individual faces and see where they are on our map. If we select sync at the top, we can then still see what's selected, but we can also see everything else. Now we can select and move these, which is pretty awesome. But for the moment, I'm going to leave them as they are. So one of the things I was saying earlier was we can look back at our UV Unwrap properties. So if we go back to Smart UV Project, we've got a couple of things here. We've got our island margin, and that's probably the key one here when it comes to doing any sort of texture painting. So at some point on here, we're going to have a natural seam where one face meets another. And if that happens to happen in a bad place, you can end up with bleeding of one texture over to another. So you may want to, with the island margin, make it larger, not by much, usually 4 to 8 pixels. And that means we've got space around all of our faces on our UV, on our texture map, that we don't have bleed between individual ones. But, as I mentioned earlier, this is now losing detail because you're effectively zooming in on that part of the texture. So this is something that you can play with. I tend to have a small margin when I'm doing a Smart UV project. We've also got our angle limit here. Never go really, really, really low. You'll crash Blender. But it basically decides how you're going to cut everything up. With a cube, there's not much to do. They're all 90-degree corners, so it's not going to do much there. Oh, the number of the devil. And we have a different object would have different results. But be careful. The smaller you make that, the more cuts will be in your UV Unwrap. And one thing before we actually start painting, when we are unwrapping like this, there's always... there's a balance to be had with Smart UV Project. We've unwrapped our object. We're done. We're now ready for texture painting. However, if you were to take this outside of Blender, would it still make sense? So if you were trying to paint in not Blender, but take the UV Unwrap, take it into Photoshop or an equivalent program or GIMP and start painting the textures within there, then you may have a problem with how it's represented in the 3D world here. You may want to do a manual UV Unwrap so it makes sense. Because I don't know at the moment what any of these refer to. This one in the lower right is the top one. And where's the bottom one? Is it the top? No. There you go. It's that one there. So that doesn't make much sense. You may want to move these islands around, and you can do that quite easily, like so, just selecting it and pressing the G key to move, just like you would in the 3D window.